cousin and niece of President Teddy Roosevelt, Eleanor. Eleanor had been orphaned at age 12 when her father, the only man in the world ever said she was beautiful, died. In 1903, he graduated from Harvard in just 3 years, and he went on to Columbia Law University and graduated and left the university before graduation. In 1905, he was appointed as Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, the youngest man in history ever to be reported to that post, age 31. A few weeks ago, I'd like to tell you just a little bit. Eleanor, she was just an outstanding woman as Franklin was a man. After the inauguration, she traveled some 39,000 miles the first year, the second year 45,000, and then it was kept secret. But she certainly was making all types of contribution in the world of women in politics. But at times she did raise storms of controversy. I talked to a woman that lives here in Olney who was the waitress at the Olney Inn. Said one day Eleanor Roosevelt came in with an African-American woman to eat. She didn't know what to do. There was no integration at that time, so she summoned Clara May Downey, and Clara May came down and looked at Eleanor and said, "Eleanor, you'll have to eat on the side porch." And Eleanor smiled and left. Eleanor spoke out for black civil rights back in 1939, and she resigned from the Daughters of the American Revolution in protest of not allowing an African-American woman by the name of Marian Anderson to speak at Constitution Hall. Franklin's mother, they learned, was the head of the house. She was the one who had the money. She was the one who owned Hyde Park. She was the one they always called Mrs. Roosevelt. At mealtime, Franklin would sit at one end of the table, the mother at the other, and Eleanor would sit in the center. In 1910, Franklin joined the Democratic Party and was elected to the New York State Senate. And during his Senate tenure, he came down with typhoid fever, which made his re-election hopes seemingly impossible. But at that point, a very remarkable man came into Franklin's life, a man by the name of Lewis McHenry Howell, an old cynical newspaper man who literally gave up his life to promote Franklin Roosevelt. On March 13, 1913, his 8th wedding anniversary, that was the date he was sworn in as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. In 1914, he ran for the United States Senate, and he lost. In 1918, Franklin faced another crisis in his life. While returning from Europe and convalescing from the flu, Eleanor was going through his mail, and there she found a letter. It wasn't a normal letter. It was a love letter. It was a love letter from her social secretary to Franklin. She went to Franklin and offered him a divorce, and they confronted Mrs. Roosevelt. And Mrs. Roosevelt looked at Franklin, and he said, "Franklin, if you leave Eleanor and the 5 kids, I will terminate your financial support." This helped Franklin make a decision whether to see Lucy Mercer again. At the age of 39 is the last time you'll ever see him walking unassisted. He was at a Boy Scout camp and marching. On August the 10th, 1921, Franklin and his wife and 3 of the children were sailing in the Bay of Fundy, and they noticed smoke billowing up from the woods. He piled his boat in, they grabbed pine parts, and he said they fought the fire for about an hour. And then Franklin says, "This deserves a great swim." He came back to Campobello, and he dipped into the water and didn't get the normal feeling that he had before, and excused himself for dinner and went to bed. The next morning he got up and he had a pain in his leg, and he limped over to the sink and started to shave, and the other leg gave way. He limped back to bed and went to bed with a temperature of 102. Hugh Gallagher, a polio victim himself, said it was cruel for an up and rising star of the Democratic Party to have to be pushed, wheeled, and carried every place that he went. What I'm going to do is slip through some of the things now and come up at the end, but Franklin was elected in 28 as governor of New York. In 30 he was re-elected governor of New York. In 32 he was elected president of the United States. Here is a man in 1932 who could not walk. He began to lead a crippled country. He went on to be elected 4 times. Then, at the end, he went to Yalta to negotiate the end of the war. Before that, he went to Casablanca. And at that meeting, he said, "I'll accept nothing less than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers." And this country thought it would be difficult for Japan and Germany to surrender with that. But he was at Woodrow Wilson's side when they negotiated the end of World War I, and they had conditions. And so Germany came back and started the war again. We took him over to Yalta. He negotiated the end of the war. He came back, told Eleanor he was going to Warm Springs, rest, and come back as he always had. He got down to Warm Springs and they put him in a chair and his body was just out of control. They knew something was wrong. He looked at the end of the concourse and he saw his little blue Ford. And a smile came across his face, but this time he was too weak to drive. They wheeled him down and placed Franklin in the passenger seat of the little blue Ford and drove him to Warm Springs. They parked up on the hill and he tried to relax, but the country wouldn't let him relax. He said Eleanor had him on the phone one day for 45 minutes trying to get appropriations for Yugoslavia, and when he hung up, he said blood veins were just projecting from his face. Franklin's daughter now had invited his old girlfriend and Elizabeth Shamatov, a Russian artist, to come down and paint a picture of her father. So on April the 12th, he wheeled into the room and they said, "Mr. President, you look pretty good." He said, "I feel pretty good." And he wheeled over to the card table, lifted himself out of the wheelchair and started signing papers. He said, "This is the way I sign bills into law." And the artist is coming over and measuring his nose and his ears, and she's painting. And all of a sudden a jerky head motion went over and he said, I have a terrible headache. He slumped over unconscious. They picked him up and carried him into the room and called for the doctor, Dr. Bruin, and he was at the spa. He came in immediately and injected adrenaline into his heart, but nothing could be done to save him. The doctors then announced to the news media that gentleman at 3:35, the President of the United States, died. They took his body back to Washington on a train, arriving 40 years or 80 years plus one day that Abraham Lincoln was shot. They had the funeral in the East Room of the White House, and after the funeral was over, the pastor had said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And Eleanor got up out of the seat, ran out up to the second floor in Indiana's room, took off her glasses and just broke down and cried. But she had heard from her husband, or her cousin, that Franklin Roosevelt